What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. We got the regular season finale on deck, man. I can't believe week 18 is already here, but we got Steelers Bengals, tons of playoff and seeding implications on the line here. Obviously, AFC North rivalry. I'm pretty excited about this game, man. So we'll go over all this kind of stuff as it relates to the playoffs, the matchup itself, and then go through some injuries as well. But first, if you guys could just hit that like button for me, subscribe, all that stuff. Hit the bell for notifications. Don't forget to drop your predictions on what you guys think will happen in this game. And I'm also curious, kind of as a temperature check, who do you guys want the Steelers to play in the first round of the playoffs? I'm just kind of curious on whether you guys have a preference, or does it just not matter to you guys one bit? So yeah, we'll talk through some injury stuff here in a second, but I think it's important for me to just go over the seeding stuff, at least as it relates to the Steelers, just so everybody's on the same page. I know some of you guys may follow this stuff, more than others. So I just want to let everybody kind of know where the Steelers stand and kind of what's on the line in this matchup. So we got some Saturday games because, the NFL, we got to play 5-6 days a week now to squeeze every single dollar out of this thing. But so Baltimore plays in the early game on Saturday. They play the Cleveland Browns. If Baltimore wins that game, the Ravens win the AFC North. Okay. So in that game, Baltimore is currently, as I get down to record this, a 20.5-point favorite against the Browns. That is because the Browns are starting Bailey Zappi, which I actually think is a good thing for the Steelers, because I think that Dorian Thompson-Robinson, in the most respectful way that I can say this, is the worst quarterback that I have seen play in the NFL this year, aside from maybe Deshaun Watson. So I'm happy that Bailey Zappi is in there and at least could give them a little bit better of a chance to win that game. But more than likely, Baltimore's going to kind of cruise in that one, and they will end up winning the division. So kind of moving on to the Steelers-Cincinnati game. So if the Steelers beat the Bengals, they will be the 5 seed in this scenario. They will end up heading to Houston to play the Texans on Wild Card Weekend. Pretty cut and dry. You win, you get the 5 seed. That's what it is, assuming Baltimore also wins. So if Pittsburgh loses to Cincinnati and the Chargers beat the Raiders, the Steelers will then end up heading to Baltimore on Wild Card Weekend. So your 3 scenarios basically are: you win the division and you'll have a home playoff game in the first round against the Chargers. You'll either head to Houston to take on the Texans, or you'll head to Baltimore to take on the Ravens. So, above all else, you don't want to go into the playoffs on a 4-game losing streak, right? How often have we heard coaches, everybody talk about trying to peak at the right time? You want to be playing your best ball this time of year. And I think that that is definitely important, especially the way that the Steelers have lost in the last 3 weeks. They've lost by, double digits in all 3 games. It's definitely uncharacteristic of this team to get, beat by 14, 17 points this many weeks in a row. So you want to get back on the right track and find your stride for sure. Some people also may say that the opponent doesn't really matter for the Steelers. They've already clinched the playoffs. You got a spot in the single elimination tournament. Roll the ball out. Let's go. I'm just not one of those people. If you guys, have listened to prior recent videos, y'all probably already know this, but I think it matters a ton, and I really can't stress it enough. I think that this is as much of a must-win game as you can have in this type of situation. Just because I think the first round opponent does matter a lot. And I think if you look at point differential, you'll really understand kind of where I'm coming from with that. So the Ravens this year, of course, they have the soon to be potential, 3-time MVP Lamar Jackson at quarterback. They have 132 point differential. So they've been 132 points better than their opponents this season. That's the 4th best mark in the NFL. That's what typical contenders are typically at this time of the year, right? Then you look at the Texans, the other team that, they could potentially play on Wild Card Weekend, assuming that they don't win the division. The Texans scored 2 points last week, 2, okay, and currently have a -9 point differential heading into the final week of the season. To put that into perspective, that's worse than a team like the Dolphins, who is going to miss the playoffs because their starting quarterback missed half the season. To be extremely blunt about this, I just don't think the Texans are a very good football team. I think the Ravens are a Super Bowl contender. There is a huge difference between these 2 teams and the way that the Steelers would play them. I think the Steelers match up fabulously against the Texans. I know that what happened last year is what happened last year. But I just think they match up so much better with them than they do the Ravens. Not to say that if that scenario does play out where they do have to go to Baltimore, yeah, the Steelers have won 8 of the last 10 matchups like that. No doubt it'll be close. Tomlin could potentially pull it out, but that's just not my preferred method or my preferred route to take in the postseason. That's just my opinion. You guys can feel differently. Like I said, drop your comments. Let me know, if you think I'm crazy or if you have a preference. But do want to talk a little bit about the injuries. The good news is in terms of like getting back on the right track, man, the Steelers are the healthier team by far coming into this matchup. You look at the injury report, the only guy on there is Dante Jackson, and he's questionable with a back injury. It's going to be a little bit touch and go just because Jackson's health has kind of been touch and go for the majority of the season. He's been kind of a little, not like in and out of the lineup necessarily, but in and out of games. He missed some time. I thought Corey Trice actually did play fairly well against the Chiefs. I know they struggled to stop the pass in that one, but it wasn't, Trice is doing in those struggles. And we can kind of talk about some of the things the defense is going to need to do to get back on the right track in this one. But yeah, I think Jackson could potentially go. That might be one of those things where, you test it in warmups. It's going to be cold. We'll see what that plays into. From a Cincinnati perspective, they've got a laundry list of injuries. It sounds like T. Higgins is going to go. He was limited in practice all week. He's questionable. Think he plays. Some of the other things like Jermaine Burton, their kick returner, who's actually been pretty good returning kicks this year. He's not going to make the trip to Pittsburgh because of a non-football related issue. So who knows what's going on with that. Both of the Bengals tackles are dealing with injuries. Orlando Brown, I think, came out and said that like he's basically playing on one leg, which is probably concerning if you're going up against a guy like Alex Highsmith. Amarius Mims, their right tackle, I liked quite a bit coming out of college. I thought he was less of a project than a lot of other people thought he was. I think he's been up and down as a rookie, like most rookie tackles are, but I do think he showed some promise. But he's dealing with a couple separate injuries. He's dealing with an ankle and also a hand injury. He's going to be going up against TJ Watt. Cam Taylor-Britt, their number one corner, also questionable with an ankle. So there's just a laundry list of stuff. I mean, there's some other things on here like Sam Hubbard. He's already been declared out, but I actually think like Joseph Asai, the guy who's been playing in his spot, has actually like outperformed him this year. So I don't actually think that that is a loss for the Bengals. But the Bengals are banged up. We'll see what the inactive list looks like for those guys. Like I said, I think some of those are like true game time decisions. Chase Brown injured his ankle against the Broncos last week, trying to like go down before the end zone. He's like their like number one back. He plays like the lion's share of the snaps and everything. He's been a DNP all week, so I don't think he's going to go. But I do think Higgins will play, and that's really ultimately what matters most probably to the Bengals is that he's out there with Jamar Chase. So, yeah, I think the big thing for me would be like Cam Taylor-Britt, because this is already a team that's having to play a guy like Josh Newton, a rookie out of TCU, somebody that I watched a decent amount of film on in college. Has had some moments, but he's already playing out there regardless. So they'll be down some secondary guys if he can't go. I really want to start talking off really with the defensive side of the ball, just because I think it's pertinent to kind of discuss some of the issues that the Steelers defense has been dealing with, particularly, as it relates to their pass defense. They've given up a ton of yards, ton of touchdowns in recent weeks. Haven't really been able to stop anybody. But I did a video on the member side of the channel. So if you guys want like an actual film room on this, you can guys go check that out. The link will be in the description, about just some of the common themes that I'm seeing on film that the Steelers defense is struggling with. And it really comes down to a couple things. Miscommunications, not being on the same page in the back end. I see some like freelancing. I see some guys trying to communicate at the snap. They're having a really hard time right now dealing with like stacks, bunches. Okay, are we passing this stuff off? Are we switching here? What are our rules in terms of like where we're going to be defending certain receivers, certain combinations, things like that. And then also like I see a defense that's kind of struggling like they really have all season. It's just kind of becoming more prevalent as the year has gone along, to plaster receivers in the scramble drill. That's particularly important because you're playing a guy like Joe Burrow, who's playing as good, if not better, than every quarterback in the league right now. Burrow can operate in the quick game. He can get the ball out really fast. Really decisive playmaker in the pocket, and just kind of shreds you with his accuracy and anticipation, particularly on the outside. Outside the numbers, things like that, but he can also extend plays. And I think that's really there's been a couple of differences in Burrow's game this year that I feel like he's kind of leveled up. And I talked about this a little bit in the earlier matchup, but I think, he's throwing to the middle of the field more than he ever has. So like, if you actually look at their numbers against like middle field close coverages, so like when there's a safety in the post in the middle of the field, or when they're seeing like middle field open. So if you're getting like cover 2, quarters, cover 6, things like that, he's like one of the best quarterbacks in the league this year against like cover 2. And like a couple years ago, that was like his boogeyman. Like he played too high. He didn't know he couldn't chuck those go balls, those back shoulder fades to his receivers, and he just looked lost. Now it's like he's ripping anticipatory throws over the middle of the field, but also like the longer he holds onto the ball, he will try to play hero ball. And that's something like there's some give and take with that because he will take some sacks, probably more sacks than some of the other elite quarterbacks do take. I don't think he's behind the best offensive line either. We'll talk about that from a matchup standpoint. But yeah, he's thrown to every level of the field. And I think it's made this passing game a lot more dangerous. Now, as it relates to like the skill position players, the way that the Steelers defended them last time was really they wanted to kind of match up Dante Jackson on Jamar Chase with some safety help over the top, usually shaded in his direction. And then there was the matchup with Joey Porter Jr. and T. Higgins. Now, Porter in that game was flagged 6 times. 4 of those ended up being accepted. Just a ridiculous game all around in this previous matchup. But I anticipate that that'll be the case again. That'll probably be the matchups that they want to look at. I think that a couple things. One, I've got to get Joey Porter to wear white gloves. I'm assuming that the Bengals are going to be wearing their white jerseys. I need him in this matchup specifically to wear white gloves so that it is not as noticeable when he's trying to grab on his jersey to try to avoid flags. I know Tomlin came out and said, like, we don't want to let that affect like his play style. We wanted to be physical, but you can't hand this good of an offense right now. I mean, they're playing so much better at a much higher level than they were even the last time these two teams faced off in week 12 or 13 or whatever. You just can't hand them this many first downs. You got to make them earn it. You got to try to take away some explosive plays. You don't want to give up a bunch of pass interference penalties 15, 20 yards down the fields, which is the exact same as explosive. So going to need Porter to, man up. I think everybody saw T. Higgins embarrass Riley Moss last week in primetime television. Riley Moss had a good year, man. Like I know a lot of people probably haven't watched that Denver defense. They've been balling. Riley Moss is a solid player at the very worst. I know he's come back from an injury, but he's played good ball this year, and T. Higgins embarrassed him. So this is like the benefit of having 2 number 1 wide receivers. Now, on the other side, Jamar Chase, it's funny. I've been watching a lot of draft prospects over the past like week or two, just trying to get caught up on some of the Senior Bowl guys. And I think it's, when you're evaluating like wide receivers that are coming out of college, you want to look at like really the 3 areas of the game for that position. Like, what do they do before the catch? What do they do at the catch point? And then what do they do after the catch? I think for Chase specifically, he was a pretty special prospect, but I think he's gotten better in terms of as a route runner. I think he's gotten better against press coverage. I wouldn't say he's like elite in that regard, but he's definitely improved before the catch. He's got reliable hands. Obviously, the speed to stretch the field vertical. He can leave guys and win at all 3 levels, which is really what you want your wide receiver ones to be able to do. And then after the catch, I think that is where his like S tier kind of qualities and where his superhuman abilities kind of come in. This is a guy that runs like 4.34. I think he's built almost like a running back. I mean, he's a pretty, he's like a little bit over 6 foot tall, but I think he's like 205, 210. He's just strong, man. Like he leads the NFL in yards after catch. I think I also saw a stat that he leads, if you're into these sorts of things, he also leads like the league, I think, in yards after catch over expectation. But I was looking, he's also forced 24 missed tackles this season. Like that is absurd for a wide receiver. The big thing with him is like he can take it to the house at any point. So like you have to make sure got to tackle well in this one. I think for both teams, that's going to be a significant talking point in the meetings because I don't think either team necessarily tackled the way that they wanted to in the last matchup. Got to make sure to get as many helmets to the ball as you can. Mike Gesicki's like giving them a solid third option. The thing about Sample being out is I'm not sure what they're going to do to give the tackles help because I think he would kind of be the guy if they wanted to, add some additional pass protection. The other thing about the pass protection element is like the Bengals, they're not a very good running team. They don't get a lot of yards after contact. Chase Brown is really more of that explosive back. He plays with really good effort, but he's also he's a threat out of the backfield, so it's going to take away a check down option for Burrow. But he's also their pass protecting back. So a guy like Khalil Herbert that they traded for midseason, he's going to be stepping into a much larger role this season. We've talked a lot about the Steelers haven't blitzed very much this year, especially with 2 really 3, I think, good blitzing off-ball linebackers. I wouldn't be surprised if they kind of tested that maybe a little bit early just to see if, Herbert, like, is his head in the game? Does he understand the protections, what Burrow's expecting him to be? And just see if you can maybe get a cheap sack, a negative play, something like that. The other thing is interesting about this is like the Bengals obviously moved the ball extremely well in that first matchup. They put up 30-something points. But Pittsburgh was able to create 3 turnovers. So I think that's the big thing is like, they've got the matchup advantages from a talent perspective. all across the defensive line. So I think that TJ Watt need a big game out of him. It's been a little bit since he's like completely flipped the game script. He had a good game the last time these two teams played. He's had some good moments against Burrow too. And then Alex Highsmith, Nick Herbig had a really, really strong game against Orlando Brown last time out. So the edge rushers, they're going to have to dominate. And I think one thing that I was kind of, when I started looking into the numbers after going back and watching a couple Bengals games, is like I was kind of surprised to see this, but the Bengals actually haven't been as good against man coverage this year as I would have anticipated, given like, Burrow, elite player. He's got two great receivers, whatever. But they're sixth in the NFL against zone coverage in terms of like EPA. They're 20th against man. And I got to thinking about it. In the first matchup, I went back and looked. The Steelers play cover one. So like their base primary man coverage that they like to play. It's usually like one of the safeties dropping down as like the robber. And then you kind of get an add-on rusher sometimes from the linebacker spot. But neither here nor there. He went 2 for 6 for 19 yards, 1 interception, and 2 sacks. So on 8 dropbacks, they got 3 splash plays. So I know that, the Steelers corners haven't played very well this season. They've given up a ton of yards. We just saw Cincinnati really go bombs away on Denver last week, who's a heavy man coverage team. So I'm not saying like you can go out there and play man coverage on 45, 50% of the snaps, but could you maybe up that a little bit on some critical down and distances? Try to get aggressive to try to take away some of those quick throwing lanes. Another thing with like that I think the Steelers do well in this matchup, and I think it's going to be a talking point, is like if Burrow is trying to really lean into the quick passing game, you're going to have to get up and press these receivers, and you're going to have to get the defensive linemen to get their hands up in the passing lane. Again, I think the formula for the Steelers, I'm pretty confident that Burrow's going to put up points. That's just like the way this offense is. They're humming right now. The Steelers defense is playing at their absolute best. I'm cool. Like if the Bengals score 24 points or something like that, that's not going to bother me a bit. Can you get 3 or 4 sacks? Can you get 2 or 3 turnovers? And can you avoid like making the big time mistake on offense, like particularly in the red zone? I think that's kind of the formula to winning because I think if you look at the other side of the ball in particular, the Steelers did whatever the heck they wanted to last time in this matchup. Russell Wilson, 18.4 total EPA. That was 93rd percentile among quarterbacks, I believe, since like 2010 or something like that. It was one of his best games from an EPA perspective ever in his career. And this is a guy that's played a lot of football. So 59% success rate. They had a 67% success rate throwing the football. One of the things I thought Russ did a really good job of last time was just, I think I did a film room on this, but just taking what the defense gives them. You can't go broke taking a profit. They played a lot of like split field coverages, so a lot of Tampa 2. They were really exposing like the speed and overall athleticism of the Bengals linebackers who don't move very well in space. They got the ball to the check down extremely well. So the running backs, I think, will be, again, a pretty big factor in this one. And also like Pat Freiermuth, he's a guy over the middle of the field. Calvin Austin caught a touchdown in this matchup last time, but Freiermuth had like some of his best games. I know my guy Smitty on Twitter talked about this, but I think 4 of Freiermuth's 7 best games of his career came against the Bengals. So he just typically finds a way to produce against this defense. We'll see if that can continue. And then I think, with George Pickens back in the lineup last week, they did get the one long ball down the left sideline where Pickens made a good adjustment late, showing late hands, got a little subtle push off against McDuffie, but he was pretty quiet last week. Obviously, a lot of the headlines have been kind of dominated with the route debacle in the red zone, whatever. Moving on past that, though, they got to find a way to get him more involved. And I think they did try some different things last week, and I just don't think it was like his best game. I thought McDuffie played him very well. They're very intentional about the ways that they guarded him, which I thought was smart, tried to take him away. But the Steelers can't allow that to happen. Like, he's by far their best and most explosive playmaker. Try to get him involved early. Pickens is also a little bit of like, he's a rhythmic player. Like, I think once you get him going and if you can keep him engaged, that's just the more dangerous he gets. I think if he goes, a couple drives without a target, I think his focus kind of wanes. I think you see that a little bit on film too, with him not being as engaged. So to me, I think, the Bengals, they don't really have necessarily anybody that I think can cover him one-on-one. I think Cincinnati probably knows that as well. Cincinnati's defense has been playing a little bit better. And that's something that I've seen a lot of stats on, just on Twitter and things like that, just over the past, since these two teams last matched up. If you look at the numbers, like they're 10th in success rate and 15th in API per play since that meeting, after being like legitimately the worst defense in the NFL up to that point. And I think, okay, like that is an improvement, but I think if you look at the actual matchups, like look at the guys that they played, man. Like they've played Cooper Rush, they played Will Levis, they played Dorian Thompson Robertson, who I just talked about, so I thought was one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL, and they play Bo Nix. So it's not exactly like a murderer's row of quarterbacks that this team has played. And I think, I went on John Ledger's podcast earlier before the season, I think, and I actually said that I thought that the Bengals defensive line without DJ Reader was going to be one of the worst run stopping units in the NFL. And that really has been mostly the case. I mean, if you look at the numbers over the course of the season, they're 29th in EPA per play, they're 31st in success rate. They just don't have a lot of bodies and a lot of guys that really hold the point of attack very well. And I think like Next Gen had a really good stat about this week, and the Steelers have used two tight end sets on 46% of their snaps. It's the fourth highest rate in the league. They're also first highest, probably not the best way to frame that, but they also lead the league in 13 personnel. So three tight ends. But when the Steelers played the Bengals in week 13, they averaged 5.5 yards per carry out of 12 and 13 personnel. One of the interesting things that Lou Anarumo and his defense was doing, they were matching 12 with nickel. So you got to think about it. The Steelers are bringing in a 6'7", 285 probably pound tight end and Darnell Washington. The Bengals are keeping a nickel cornerback out there and Mike Hilton, who's like 5'10", $180. So if they're going to do that, you have to run the football, especially if they're going to play too high and only have like 6-7 guys in the box. You got to be able to run the football. And I'm optimistic that they can. I think Jaylen Warren is even healthier this time around. He's playing some pretty solid ball. I would like to see him get some more early down carries. So that was something I wrote about after the loss last week. I would just like to see him get a little bit more work on early downs and see kind of what that does to the run game, because I do think that that's going to be a big factor for them. The other thing is like with Trey Hendrickson, he leads the NFL in sacks. You look at like pressure numbers, everything, like he's at the very top of the leaderboards. I always talk about with Hendrickson, you have to run at him. You have to make sure that you make him play on rundowns and not just let him like tee off on the passer. He's had some big games against Dan Moore Jr. in the past. The big thing is like just like it is whenever you're going up against any of these like game wrecking pass rushers, you can't let them take over the game single handedly. And I think the Steelers had a good plan for that last time, with the quick passing game, getting the ball out, using some screens, and kind of neutralizing him in some creative ways. And I kind of hope that they have a good plan for that in particular. And Lou Anarumo is a guy that I've always had like a lot of respect for. I think that he's probably coaching for his job Saturday. And I'm not even sure, even if they did play well and lost the game, I still don't know if he would keep it. So this is a desperate Bengals group. And this is something that I don't think like you can necessarily measure. Like you can watch all the film that you want to watch. You can comb through all the stats. But this is a must-win game, literally, for the Bengals. They've got to win and get a ton of help. So they're going to be playing for their season. This is the last time that we could see like Jamar Chase, T. Higgins and Joe Burrow in a Bengals uniform, all three together. Who knows what happens with Trey Hendrickson after this? Like I said, Lou Anarumo, back-to-back down years on the defensive side of the ball. So like there's a lot of incentive for them to really lay it all on the line and empty the clip, if you will. So they're going to be a desperate team. I think the big thing for the Steelers is like they need to kind of do what they did last time in terms of playing with a lead, making sure they dictate the terms of engagement. I think the Steelers offense has got to get off to a better start. I know this is something we've talked about every single week on the podcast or on the channel. Got to get off to a better start and try to play ahead, because that's the thing about this Bengals team is like they could put up points in a hurry. Like the worst thing that can happen is like you go out there and get down like 14-3 or something like that in the second quarter, and then the Steelers have to feel like they got to get a little bit more one-dimensional, and then you're fighting to claw back and things like that. And that's not the way that this Steelers team is necessarily built. But the last thing I'll say, man, is like I still think that this Bengals defense is pretty bad. I am really just hoping that the Steelers offense, even if it's not to the tune of like 40 something points and 520 yards or whatever they had the first time. I'm not saying I need that, but I just need them to go out. This should be a get right game for Russ, for Arthur Smith, for the offense. The Steelers aren't the most talented offense. They're more talented than the Bengals defense is. So I expect Anarumo is going to make it more difficult on them this time around. But I also just don't think the talent on that side of the ball is really going to allow him to be too awfully creative in the things that he wants to do. And will say straight up, man, I'll be really, really disappointed if the Steelers can't get back on the right track here against this Bengals defense. And like I said, the formula for the Steelers defense is really simple, man. Like, you got to make sure that you force a couple turnovers. You're not gonna hold them out the end zone, man. You try to hold them to field goals when they get down there in the red zone. You're not gonna hold them to low scoring outputs. Like, I would be shocked if they held the Bengals under like 20, 21, 24 points. It's gonna be a high scoring affair if they're gonna win it. But you got to make sure you try to get 2-3 turnovers, get a couple sacks to stall out some drives, and then hope that you can, put up 28, 30 points, something like that. So, as always, I really appreciate your all's continued support. And so we got a weird time game, so a Saturday night game. So I'll try to have the recap up early on Sunday morning. Try to get that out to you guys, hopefully before like the 1 o'clock game start and all that stuff. But yeah, we got the playoffs on the horizon. I'm really excited to get into that. So hopefully you guys enjoy your weekend. I will talk to you soon. Peace and love.